Hello, everyone. This is the Austrian Economics Society. I'm Andrew Krishon.
I'm Michael Galchich. Hello.
And today we'll be discussing the Marginal Revolution and two papers by Emil Kauder on the history of the Marginal Revolution in particular, which is the retarded acceptance of marginal utility theory and
the genesis of marginal utility theory from Aristotle to the end of the 18th century.
So that all probably sounds incredibly dense and boring. We'll try to liven it up, keep it lively. It's a little dense and boring, though, so I apologize for that.
Spoiler.
All right, so we're gonna start off with some questions here I wrote, mostly concerning that first paper, the retarded acceptance of marginal utility theory. It's a short read, only about 13 pages, a little dense. Did the British Classical Economists help or hamper the development of marginal utility theory, at least according to Kauder, the author? And she, right?
It's a he.
He, Emil. I can never tell that.
Emil.
He says that the British Classical Economists did hamper the theory, according to him, because they all had various versions of the labor theory of value, where price is proportional to the amount of labor in the product. So the price of the product is proportional to the amount of labor, whereas marginal utility theory has a different theory of price. And so the British Classical Economists focus on the labor theory of value, meant that they kind of steered economics away from marginal utility theory while they had influence, which was from 1750 or so up to like 1870 in the Marginal Revolution.
Even probably a bit after too.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And so Adam Smith is the British Classical Economist that most people know best. Jean-Baptiste Say was a Frenchman, but he's usually counted as the British Classical Economist as well. Who else? John Locke, I think, counts in this school.
Ricardo.
Yeah, Ricardo.
Malthus. Did we get comments? Is that what that was?
No, I think we're keep tracking.
It's probably a bit after too.
Yeah.
Turn your volume off
I
here.
think we're getting playback.
And so Adam Smith.
Yeah, turn the volume on the computer off.
All right.
There we go. So,
See who else can we lump in there? Mill, the first Mill,
oh yeah,
and even the second Mill. So John Stuart Mill and I forgot the other ones.
John Stuart Mill was the second
Stanley.
one, right?
Yeah.
The first one was John Mill. No, am I wrong on that? No.
I think it was John's.
They were both
middle
Englishmen, and they were both wrong, so don't worry about it too much. All right, so who is the earliest writer to touch on marginal utility theory? And that would be Aristotle, who had a kind of primitive version of marginal utility theory. But despite being kind of primitive by today's standards, it was a lot closer to the truth than, say, Adam Smith's theory of price. So Aristotle kind of really had control of all of Western thought up till and even after the Reformation, because the Catholic dogma was Aristotle. St. Thomas took Aristotle and put him in the Catholic tradition, so he was actually scripture. So Aristotle was taught by the priests as part of Catholic divinity school. And then the Protestants also taught Aristotle. So Adam Smith was taught Aristotle when he was being educated in England. So everyone kind of knew about Aristotle's works. The difference was that the mainland European Catholic economists were taught by priests and taught Aristotle as scripture, as holy writ, whereas the Protestants, they thought Aristotle was a cool guy, but he wasn't in Protestant scripture. He wasn't divinely part of the holy whatever.
Gospel or
yeah. What other schools of economics had early versions of marginal utility theory? Do you want to talk about the Italian economists here?
You can throw them in. I think that's a good segue into this paper too. So, I mean, Emil Kauder mentions the Italians, the French. There's a couple of French writers and a couple of Swiss writers that could probably get mentioned here. But the main part is the Italians, who would be like people following Lotini, and that would be Davanzeri and Giuliani or something like that. And they were around probably from about
Giuliani
15.
is tough on terrorism.
Yeah, not so much a good man. But imagine this is one of his like great grandfathers. There's someone in that family who did something bad. See, but so yeah, these were people who were around like in the 15th century and onwards, probably until about the 17th century. I think that's when Giuliani was around, not the mayor. And they're really known for pushing the subjective elements within Aristotle, and they kind of formed a rudimentary theory of imputation. So it's not, let's say, the costs that drive price, but rather, the value of the final consumer good that gets imputed back through the production process. And,
whereas the labor theory of value would say, if it requires 100 hours of labor to make this product, it will be 100x. That will be the price.
Yeah.
If it requires 50 hours of labor, it will be 50x. And there's kind of different distinguishments for skilled versus unskilled in some of these labor theories of values, but all ultimately they have price as a function of labor, rather than the labor being a function of price. And the big difference being that if you can make the same good for 1/10 the labor through automation, this isn't going to mean automatically that it's going to cost 1/10 as much. You can have the exact same good for selling at the same price that requires less labor. The labor is not, if you want to build a construction project, you could use spoons instead of jackhammers, and it won't necessarily make the exact same product or a better product than if you use jackhammers, right? Because labor theory value would say if you use jackhammers instead of spoons, your product would sell for less money because less labor went into it, if it's wholly a function of labor.
And then, let's see, what else can you add to that? What else did they do? They probably also had a rudimentary theory of price, too, going onwards to Turgot on the French side of the subjective camp. And I think he was one of the first to actually do that, to have a complete, as to how price comes about through two subjective evaluations in trade.
And Turgot was personal friends with Adam Smith. So Adam Smith kind of has no excuse here. He read Aristotle, he was good friends with Turgot. And Turgot had a theory of marginal utility that was kind of similar to Wicksel's in the 20th century, a very modern theory of marginal utility. So Smith, was exposed to this, and for whatever reason, never abandoned his very primitive labor theory of value, which is kind of universally abandoned by economists nowadays. And so the question maybe is why? Why did Smith cling so hard to his labor theory of value? In fact, his earlier works are almost less based on it. He got more and more of a passion for the labor theory of value as he went on. And Kauder's thesis has to do with Smith's religious training and upbringing, and then also Smith kind of got swept up in the Presbyterian revival and became very influential in that, and that motivated his thinking in a lot of ways. And so again, this is a Calvinist philosophy. The Calvinists, they praise labor. Labor is good in and of itself. And for Calvinism to kind of work as a philosophy, you need some theory of labor being proportional to price, because Calvinism's philosophies go out, make a bunch of money, work hard. Well, making a bunch of money and working hard aren't necessarily the same thing. You need something to tie those two together, and that would be the labor theory of value, where the higher the price of something, the more labor that went into it, and thus making money and labor are the same thing. That's kind of Calvinist dogma, whereas that kind of quickly falls apart if you say that, no, you can make the same amount or more money with less labor. Labor is not inherently good. In fact, we would kind of, modern economics, we want to be vert fry. Yeah. So we don't want to say labor is inherently bad, but labor is inherently a disutility is how most modern economists define it. So where if you're really having fun at your job, actually, a lot of economists would say, well, like, it's kind of like paid play. Like labor is defined by its degree of disutility. If something is useful to you rather than disuseful, you shouldn't even really be calling it labor by many economists' definitions.
Sounds good. So you can also follow that up with tying it onto the second article. Or do you have that as a question? The scientific aspect of Smith.
Oh, yeah, the
Push,
scientific.
push towards a sort of Newtonian, and that move economics towards the Newtonian objective measurements, stuff like that whole thing. And I think Ricardo is also big on that aspect of it.
And marginal utility theory is a subjective theory because the values differ depending on how much of something you have. So if you have 100 apples, you value each apple less than if you have 95 apples. This is the diminishing marginal utility of identical units. So it's not that every value is identical and value is objective. It's that value is very subjective. And in particular, for an individual, his valuations will vary depending on the quantity he has because you have the diminishing marginal utility of identical units. So, a homeless person values $1 more than a millionaire is one way to put it. There's lots of different ways of putting marginal utility.
Can we even say that, though?
Well, identical units, right, is another
interpersonal comparisons of utility.
Oh, yeah, that's true
another
as well.
Which is what Bernoulli did.
Yeah.
But
and then also identical units is something that's tricky with marginal utility because it makes sense if we're talking about like gallons of oil or something, but dollars is kind of tricky. Are dollars identical units? Because kind of if they're not identical units, then we're not even talking about the diminishing law of marginal utility. And in some sense, you can have situations where marginal utility doesn't hold for money, where you might actually value. So, one situation that's brought up is if you give a homeless person $1, he will value that dollar less than if he had $19 and he gave him $1. Why? Because he wants to go out and buy a whole handle. So if he has $19, he really values $1 because that's enough for him to go to buy a whole handle. If you give him $1 and he has $0, oh, that's enough for a nip. But that was how someone explained to me. I mean, you kind of have to search for instances where marginal utility isn't true with money, but I think they do occur. And so that, I think, shows you that I think it's the identical units part of marginal utility with money that makes it. So let's see. Who was the first person to magnetize marginal utility theory?
Like the complete sort of aspect of it, or?
Well, I was fishing for Bernoulli here. What was Bernoulli's contribution to marginal utility theory? Why don't I put it that way?
For Bernoulli, was the whole diminishing returns aspect of it, and let's see, what else did he do? He also was the early mathematizer of it. And if sure we can explain further on Bernoulli's other theories that
this is the same guy as the Bernoulli effect. So airplanes fly because of the Bernoulli effect. Is the theory of pressure dynamics in physics. And so as a physicist, he probably is way too physics envious.
Yeah, as you can tell, because he was a big theorizer who tried to create some sort of social utility and a way to compare utility between two people. And I think in this paper, Kauder mentions that he mentions that Bernoulli was saying that for a wealthier person, one ducat is worth as much as maybe half a ticket for a poor person, but you can't really make such comparisons.
This is the util. Economists, if you take a microeconomics class, you'll run into these ridiculously stupid things called utils, which are supposedly objective measures. Yeah, utils are futile. They're supposedly objective values, objective units of measurement of value. Of course, the Austrians know value is subjective. You can't do this. And actually, if you take like a grad school economics class, they'll tell you utils are bullshit. What they'll tell you is it's a discrete function, which just means that there is no function. You value things however you want, and they're useless. I had a guy who was taking graduate economics at Harvard come to the Boston group and discuss how when it's only undergrad util theory that is so astoundingly stupid. When you get to graduate school, they tell you that it's a discrete scalable function, and they throw in enough qualifiers that it's a function that could literally do anything.
Right.
And so at that point, yeah, it's compatible with Austrian economics just because you've given your definitions enough leeway that a util is a completely meaningless concept.
I did into oblivion.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I guess we can also go into Gosen in the other paper, right? He was also one of the early, according to Kauder, you would say he was one of the earliest ones to be very close to creating a whole, view of subjective value and marginal utility very close to, let's say, the ones in the Marginalist Revolution. Is that accurate?
Yeah, according to Kauder, Gosen was kind of the real discoverer of the finalized modern version of marginal utility theory, and then
Just have bad luck or something.
Yeah.
He wrote it, in German at the height of the historical schools, ascendance. And, because of that, and he wasn't even a professor or something, he was like an army sergeant or something, right? So, of course, no one's going to read, something from some random guy, especially the historical school, because all this video. So.
And the historical school was like Menger's arch enemy in Germany. So Menger was the one who kind of came up with marginal utility theory in Germany, and the historical school, or Austria, and the historical school was the opposition there in mainland continental Europe. In England, it was kind of the currency school, and the British economists were the main opposition to. Jevons was English, right? Jevons was English. So he was the one in England who came up with this independently. Menger was the German, and Walras was Swiss, I want to say. Yeah, Swiss.
From Luzon.
So I don't know if there were bad economists in Sweden. Or no, he was Swiss or Swedish?
Swiss.
Swiss,
Sorry,
that's right.
sorry.
Okay. Yeah, Jevons is Swiss, right? Walras. Jevons is English.
Although Jevons did have, on a tangent, a very weird theory of business cycles related to sunspots and stuff like that. So, kind of an interesting side topic for another discussion.
The sunspot theory of the business cycle. I bet.
That would make for quite interesting reading, I think.
Give a PhD mathematician a grant, and they'll find you a correlation.
Someone get on it.
Yeah.
With a Jevons scholarship for business cycle theory.
So what was Turgot's theory of marginal utility? Or was it different than Wicksell? No, Turgot's theory was roughly the same as Wicksell, so it's a very modern theory. And Adam Smith was friends with Turgot again, so kind of no excuse for Smith and the British Classical Economists not catching on to this. With Kauder's thesis being that it was mostly a religious thing, where the Catholic economists were quicker on the uptake to marginal utility because they didn't have the glorification and the deification of labor that the Calvinist Protestant economists had. And, keep in mind, back in the 1700s and 1800s, if you were studying economics, you were being taught by a priest in mainland Europe. Religion had not there were no secular universities really, and then in England you were being taught not by a priest but by some Protestant religious figure, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, that's right, because when Smith was a professor, he was not actually the professor of economics.
Divinity, right?
Yeah, or something like that. Yeah. Same, I think Hume was in that same boat too, even though he had some economic writings.
So nowadays, if you go up to an economist and say your theories are awful because you're a Protestant, they're probably going to take that very personally. But it did kind of make some sense back in
Be like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. Get punched in the face. Gary North will sock you.
And he'll write an awful article about it too. One time I got him. Say Rothbard's with me.
Okay, so if the cardinal sin of Calvinism is the glorification of labor, what's the problem with Aristotelian scholastic theory? And he said, Kauder said that Aristotle and a lot of people that followed him were hung up on the fair price.
Yes.
And to be fair, so were the Calvinists. They also had a theory of the fair price. And so until economics escaped that theory of the fair price, it really wasn't going to go anywhere and accurately be able to describe supply and demand.
That's what Aquinas spent a lot of time on, was the fair price. Or I think they called it the just price, I guess, back then.
No.
Doesn't matter. But yeah, so basically it was when you would trade, like, it would be, a fair trade. They were trying to figure out, okay, no one's getting exploited. Exploitation was a very big thing for these type of guys.
And if the price of something is proportional to the labor, then you really had like a reason to beef with someone if you thought they were giving you a fair price. Is hey, I've got 800 utils in here, and you're giving me something worth 400 utils. What are you trying to pull on me? So there's lots more
the reason on this, right?
Yeah. But luckily, the economists escaped to the fair price fallacy up until Bernie Sanders.
Yes, the great economist Bernie Sanders.
If you ever want to see something funny, by the way, go find Paul Krugman's textbook and then compare it against the columns he writes. Because he's making boatloads of money, talking about fair prices and how labor is getting an unfair price in his newspaper columns. And then he makes boatloads of money talking about how there's no such thing as a fair price and minimum wages cause shortages in his textbooks. So there's an economist who understands price theory, right? He's making money on both sides of this.
I guess it's like Krugman qua economist and Krugman qua whatever, editor, whatever. What is his even title at the New York Times? What is it like?
Blogger.
Squawker? It's not even, I don't even know.
But
well, I guess we'll leave that.
He admitted that. I remember during that You're Thinking Economics conference.
Yeah, someone called him out on that.
Yeah, he was like, yeah, my op-eds have nothing to do with what I won the Nobel Prize for, and you shouldn't take my op-eds as endorsed by the Nobel Committee in any way, shape, or form.
He escaped before anyone could ask him any further questions.
Yeah.
Good times. Okay.
Why is Adam Smith's... Or actually, I think we went over that one. What is Aristotle's theory of work and pleasure? We're talking about the Calvinist theory of you glorify work, make yourself suffer, work hard, make as much money as possible. This is like good in the Calvinist theory. So what is Aristotle's theory? Which was
the natural order. Something like that. You have to do it just to be, to survive or whatever.
And kind of like pleasure was the good in Aristotle's theory. So this is a lot more similar to
Mona, whatever.
Yeah. So this is kind of similar. You can see how Aristotle's theory fits with marginal utility more, where it's all about the margins of, do I want 5 drinks or 4? Well, if it costs 10 cents more, I guess I won't get that 5th drink. It's like this is really a theory of pleasure and pain. At the margins, you need a kind of pleasure to be the motivating factor, not like self-deprecation and making yourself miserable and working, because work is not a good thing in and of itself. If jobs were the point, then they should dig with spoons instead of shovels, as Milton Friedman said. And so, yeah. And so Aristotle, though, he didn't have pleasure as being good proportionally. He had pleasure in small units was good. Pleasure in large units is like heroin or something bad. And so
I think in that piece too, to tie it to the whole religion thing, I think Smith argues against it and invokes God as a reason for it too.
Yeah.
Or this is why it's a divine work is a divine aspect of the economy or whatever like that. And there's a quote I think in there. I don't remember, but he invokes God and stuff like that. So
yeah,
you can't escape it. Adam Smith, the non-work Friday economist.
No. Yeah, the fair price.
How dare you.
Is all about the fairness and the living wage, and
we haven't gotten far in the century too, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I wonder if it's just like self-selection at this point. If like economics majors just can't follow politics, because you have to figure there's a crowd of 30,000 people at like a raise the minimum wage rally. Like,
right.
Some of them have to be economics majors, right? So are they just like sucking it down, or is it just cognitive dissonance? Like, I don't know. Because really, economics is very uniform in how it's taught, and it's micro at least isn't taught half bad. That there's marginal utility, supply and demand. Prices determine marginal supply and demand, and if you fix prices, you're going to get a shortage or an oversupply. Yeah. And there's no like footnotes with unless it's for poor people. You know, microeconomics
insert feels here.
Yeah, insert feels here. The price gouging box of doom. Economic rules don't apply.
Yeah.
And then they get so worked up about the academic experts in science about like the global warming thing, which fine, like trust the experts, trust the scientists. They talk about that so much when it comes to global warming, but then like try bringing up at a Bernie Sanders rally, like, oh, did you know 96% of economists are against the minimum wage? Like,
dualism. Yeah. Then they'll say stuff like economics is not a real science and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That's pick and choose, if you will, I guess.
Yeah. All right, let's trash on Marchal. So Marchal kind of was an early adopter of the Marginal Revolution, and he's credited with the supply and demand, curve thing. It's called the Marshallian cross. But he kind of didn't really have it because he, instead of having supply and demand, he had supply and cost, and he was very focused and still hung up on a cost theory of value, not quite the labor theory that Adam Smith had. He was an adopter of Ricardo's cost theory of value, which I think had some labor elements and was also very land-based as well. Anything else to add from Marchal?
There's also his sort of religious aspect of it too for Kauder. He mentions that, Marchal was raised the son of an evangelical preacher or something like that. So, and he's saying how, Marchal tried to repress this, but he never succeeded in his writings or something like that. But, it's if you buy Kauder's, I guess conjecture at that point, but, it might be worth, thinking about.
And, economists, usually they're like trashing on Catholics. So this is a big like redeeming grace of Catholicism in the economics literature because, economists do a lot of research about the Protestant work ethic where they try to pick apart like GDP percentage differences in the different German towns. Some of them are like Protestant and Catholic. And the Freakonomics guys talk about this a lot with like their explanation for why Protestant places have higher GDPs, is like they have fewer kids, and there's a lot of economists on this side. But this is like the other side of like, no, let's stop picking on the damn Catholics. The Catholics were right all along about economics. Maybe Protestant economies are good, but Protestant economists are horrible.
There's actually a good Kauder quote on that. I don't know if it's from any of these two papers, but it says you can't judge an economist by the place he lives in, but rather his theory or something like that.
Yeah,
and it makes perfect sense in that regard. It's kind of funny. But another one is McCloskey's whole theory of bourgeoisie dignity and stuff like that, and she says it ties into the whole Protestant work ethic and stuff like that. So she's saying if there was no, Protestant revolution, there might not have even been an industrial revolution, in her opinion. So.
And then there's a lot of like kind of these funny little Protestant Catholic battles. Another one is the whole like progressive movement. And if you read like stuff on the Mises Institute site, which is again staffed, almost entirely by Catholics. That kind of like the free market take of the 1920s and 1900s American politics is that there was this Protestant backlash reaction to the boatloads of Catholic immigrants that were coming. And that Protestant xenophobic reaction was the progressive movement. That's kind of the historical lens to see the progressive movement through, where the kind of the Protestant locals, they wanted to push a couple of things through at once to retain their power and make sure the Catholic immigrants didn't take it, and that was one, ban alcohol. But they couldn't ban alcohol because that was how the federal government funded itself. So two, income tax, you need that as well. And in order to kind of get these things through, you also needed to double the number of Protestant votes. The Catholics that were coming were almost all men, young single men were coming. So by giving women the vote, they ensured the Protestants would be able to outvote them for at least the next couple of decades. So kind of like the sociological, cultural aspects of the progressive movement were very kind of pro-Protestant, anti-Catholic at their kind of cultural foundations as well.
That's another good one for that is the whole public schooling thing too. The
Yeah.
Protestants were heavily, into that too. And then a good example is in New York City, where not really the progressive era, but slightly before, like in the late 1800s, all the Catholics were very much against, public schooling for their kids in New York City, for example. And then the Protestants started, passing laws and stuff like that for it. So I guess just another interesting thing like that.
Yeah, it's like it's funny, the whole like, oh, America's always been great and then more immigrants keep on coming and ruining it narrative that is sometimes pushed by the Mises Institute, but that completely is like undone when you're talking about early 1900s American politics, where like the whole progressive movement was this WASP, nativist backlash, and like the good guys from a libertarian perspective were the Catholics. The unwashed immigrants coming in against, the unwashed immigrants were the ones voting to not have an income tax and keep alcohol legal, So pro
Don't tell somebody point out that one.
Yeah,
No.
we can go a little off topic, whatever. No one's listening. Lou Rockwell's had a funny thing on one of his speeches. He's kind of getting more xenophobic again, like he was in the 90s, and he's like, every time there's a wave of immigration to the U.S., the crime rate goes up. It's like, okay, Lou, so are you saying that you wish those damn Catholics didn't come in 1900 so we would have had alcohol banned quicker and the income tax sooner? Because that's how it would have worked out. If the Catholics didn't come in as great numbers in the early 20th century, America would have been hyper progressive. Alcohol, we probably would still have alcohol prohibition if not for the massive number of Catholics who came.
The unseen, if you will.
Yeah. What is it, like Al Smith was the Catholic mayor of New York who was like just flaunting his nose at the feds and saying, we're a wet city, I don't care what the federal law says.
That's funny. Yeah, Coolidge would visit very often.
Yeah. Yeah, Harding too, drank publicly in the Oval Office. Nice. So gangster. It'd be like Obama just smoking blunts during press conferences. Fuck it.
Maybe in the last couple of months.
Yeah.
Presidency.
Laid up position.
Whatever. What are you gonna do about it? I'll just part of it myself.
Let's see. Do you have any more stuff? We're still somewhat serious on the Italian economists you want to talk about, or did we about beat this horse to death?
I think for the Italians, it's pretty good. They were very close to having imputation theory, right, which we mentioned. And I believe
imputation theory again is that the wage of a blacksmith is dependent on the price of his products. The price of his products are not dependent on the wage of a blacksmith.
Right. Oh, another good point too. I think it was Bottini. He was very close to having time preference, right?
Oh.
So he says man does not even pay enough attention to his future. He overrates his present needs because it follows his senses, which reveal his present wants, and not his reason with which he may plan for the future. So he's almost quite time preference, but it's not quite. He's kind of putting in overrating, so he's kind of using non-verified terms for it, not really discounting or anything like that.
Yeah,
he's almost there. Constant slack, but
although I think overrate literally is a synonym for discount when you think about it, right? Because if there's oh no, that would be underrate. Would be a synonym for discount.
Maybe this is not a very good translation either. But in either case, he was very, very close to having time preference down.
When did Kauder write again?
He was around. I think he was actually at the Mises Circle, so he was one of the followers of Mises in that regard.
So in the 50s or so.
Yeah, this came out in what did it say? This one is from '53 in the paper on Marginal Utility Theory. He also has a book on the history of marginal utility, which is about $70 on Amazon if you're going to shell it out. But I believe you said you found it on Google Books. I don't know if the whole
I don't know. Yeah, they may not have had the whole thing. Google Books often has a third of the book up there.
Yeah, I'm assuming it's probably just these two papers in more detail.
Yeah.
But I mean, it would be I think worth looking into, because you don't value theory represented too often in the history of economic thought. It's just, all right, what did Smith say? Okay,
we did one day of economic history in I took one formal economics macro class, and the one day of economic history, the impression you got was marginal utility didn't exist before the Marginal Revolution. It was just independently discovered stroke of genius. No one could have ever seen it before.
Like, these guys just came out of nowhere.
Whereas Kauder kind of says economists always had this. It's just common sense. The real story is how wrong Smith and the English economists were. And that kind of came out of nowhere. And it was due to this Calvinistic theology that kind of screwed up economics for 150 years until we got back to its roots. So, Rothbard, I haven't read Rothbard's thing, so I'm not vouch for it, but he has a scathing critique of Adam Smith, and I'm assuming he probably read Kauder is where he got that from. Maybe he didn't.
I know Rothbard cites Kauder on the Scholastics, or the School of Salamanca.
Yeah.
I'm sure you prefer. In regards to Smith, I don't know if he does. I mean, it might be worth looking into. But Rothbard was definitely familiar with Kauder's works. So.
And this isn't to say that Adam Smith didn't understand things about the market and had a lot of insights about incentives and spontaneous order. Just his theory of prices was horrible. It's just the complete opposite, really. And maybe we could talk a little about how this theory even kind of makes sense, where you have the amount of labor determines the price, because if you're a businessman making decisions at the margins, you're going to add, another employee at $10 an hour if they can bring in $10 or more an hour of profits. And so there's kind of a general correlation between the marginal profit being brought by a worker and his marginal wage. But again, this relationship is backwards. It's imputed. It's not that you add up how many workers it takes to make a product and that's how you get the price. It's that you take the price and you figure out what you need to do to make it. And that's how you figure out what you pay each of your workers. Because if, for instance, you have a very skilled, specific sword maker or something, and suddenly his swords double in people's appreciation for them, his wage is going to double. If suddenly people stop liking his swords, his wage will go to zero. It's the wages are profits. Yeah, that's what you're telling me. The wages are imputed from consumer desires, and it's true for just kind of unskilled labor as a whole, as it is for skilled labor. And then it's true of land as well, because Ricardo has the theory that prices are determined by the subjective land factor. No, it's the other way around. Land prices are determined by the goods prices. For instance, the land in France that grows, champagne is worth millions and millions of dollars because you can grow champagne on it. If people stop drinking alcohol tomorrow, that land's price would plummet. It's not that you add up how many acres of this expensive land and that's how much champagne costs. It's that, no, this land costs that much because consumers value champagne.
Oh, it was Galliani, not Giuliani. Sorry.
Galliani.
Yeah, he had a good passage on that. Let me see if I can find it real quick. There's a quote from him. Let's see. So yeah, this is from Galliani. The value of labor is determined by the peculiar utility and scarcity of the specific kind of labor and demand. And there's a quote from him in here. The actual quote, I guess, translated into English. Value then is a ratio, and this is compounded of two ratios expressed by the names utility and scarcity. So, rather than cost.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, the Austrians, I think, are comfortable speaking of utility. We use that word a lot, and scarcity. So supply and demand, how are those different than utility and scarcity? Maybe we should talk about, because supply, the supply curve and the demand curve are both impacted by scarcity and utility, but they're kind of combinations of the two. So he didn't quite have modern marginal utility theory where you have supply and demand determining price. because he had utility and scarcity determining price, whereas nowadays we would say what utility and scarcity are how you get your demand and supply curves, and their intersection is the price. Or if you want to be Lockman or Moravsky, you say it's all a bunch of nonsense.
Hold it back. I'll be nice. That's another discussion. I guess we can say insofar as you take time out of the equation. Yeah. Sure. We'll go follow the Newtonian path of economics.
Oh yeah, do we talk enough about physics envy? Maybe we should talk some more about how.
So yeah, I think Moravsky should read Kauder. Basically, is what I'm getting at this, because Moravsky has that book, More Heat Than Light, where he talks about the whole physics envy of the classical economists. You know how they wanted objective measures of certain things, such as labor, how much labor went into something. The cost of something, can we measure that in some sort of objective standard? So, what else can you say about them?
And like Adam Smith was writing during the time of the great classical geniuses like Newton, and so Smith was trying to put out kind of a theory of price similar to Newton's kind of theory of physics, where you would have these objective factors determining price in the same way that you have objective masses, velocities, etc., determining mass velocity in the future. Is a deterministic theory of price where labor determines price, and this determinism is what is absent in kind of modern Austrian economics, especially Lachmann's Austrian economics, where there really is no determinism. Everything is kind of, in chaos theory terms, you would say a non-linear system, so that any sort of perturbation can yield a wholly unpredictable result, and there's no way of foreseeing prices. And if price was a simple function of labor or any other objective good, then price would never change, right? It would just be, oh yeah, we found the price, there it is.
All right, we're done here.
We're done here. No role for speculators, right? There would be no role for who knows the price better? It's no, just add up the labor.
Yeah, there really is no role at all for expectations for the future at all in such a theory. So it's okay. All right, we're done. We're good. Go home now.
And then I know Kevin Carson, the mutualist Austrian, tried to bring back the labor theory of value, but mix it with Austrian subjective value theory. And it was saying that it's not, I guess, supply and demand of labor, it's the alternate use of labor and how valuable that is. So the labor works in a factory only if he doesn't have anything else better for him going, like a small subsistence farm. And to me, it just seems like he doesn't understand supply and demand, because that is factored into the supply curve. Yeah, the supply curve includes alternate choices by definition. It's a marginal theory where on the margins, I would do this instead of that if the price was higher.
Because
So I just think Carson tried to be witty and leftist, and because all the leftists love the labor theory of value. Like Marx is based on Smith, really. Marx actually likes Adam Smith. If you read Das Kapital, he says glowing things about Adam Smith. There's actually an edition of the two books that's together that has Das Kapital and Wealth of Nations together, where they have lots of cross references. So Marx was very influenced by Smith, and so in some sense, some people say, we have Adam Smith to thank for economics and capitalism. Actually, maybe what's more true is we have Adam Smith to thank for setting economics back 150 years in Marxism. That actually might be more like Marxism, I think, is kind of more a direct result of Adam Smith than capitalism in a lot of senses.
That's funny. But yeah, I mean, that goes into, there's that theory that Marx never finished writing Das Kapital, the last couple of volumes of it, because he realized, the labor value theory is not correct, so I'm just going to not bother writing anywhere.
I know I haven't read all of Das Kapital, but what I read in the first part of it, he was praising Adam Smith and saying his economics are right, and capitalism was the best system up until, this new economic system we're going to have.
Historicism.
yeah, so like the first third of Das Kapital is like praising capitalism, which confuses a lot of people. But Marx thought that capitalism was better than feudalism, but then he thought socialism was better than capitalism.
Yeah. One thing I will give Marx is that I guess in that during this process before the end of time, where we're all back to communism,
Yeah.
He did realize that capitalism was a very dynamic sort of thing. I know this is totally off topic, but
It's relevant. I always like beating up, for instance, like Bernie Sanders supporters with Marx. Like,
it's
like,
great.
hey, did you know that Marx thought the minimum wage was a bad idea? It was like watching a Bernie Sanders supporter try and deal with that.
That explodes.
Yeah. And then like the Trump supporters even better, where like, oh, you realize like Trump supports tariffs, like. You realize that not only like Keynes but also Marx opposed tariffs, right? Like Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump is like more anti-market than both Marx and Keynes. That's been the one good thing about Trump is he's gotten all the liberals to remember that they hate tariffs, because that's kind of supposed to be part of the liberal platform is being against tariffs, but they don't like to focus on that too much. Like the Canadian Liberal Party has it more at its center than like the U.S. liberals, and like Sanders is against the trade deals. And I'm not saying that trade deals are a good thing, but liberals don't talk about tariffs a lot nowadays in America. But then as soon as Trump started talking about tariffs, NPR was doing stories on how, every economist agrees tariffs are a bad idea. They had that story the other day where Donald Trump wants to raise tariffs. What do economists say? Well, every economist in history is against it. So, this has been a good upside of the Trump campaign is it's gotten people talking about tariffs and specifically how bad they are.
Yeah.
Now, I'm also against the free trade deals, but that's, a whole nother topic. I think Trump's actually right on that the free trade deals are
so free.
Yeah.
Or it's great having, treaties about things not involving, other parties than yourself. Yeah, we'll have a treaty, but all these people will just pretend they can make a decision for them. But that's not really economics anymore. But
I mean, it's just the way I see it is by lowering tariffs for these deals, what you do is you get rid of political comparative advantage. Because the whole point of trade is to utilize natural comparative advantage. And also, I'd say to utilize comparative political advantage, where things are cheaper in one regime than another because of tax structures, or where things are legal in one regime and not in another. So, for instance, you can buy hemp product in the U.S., but you can't manufacture hemp in the U.S. You have to buy Canadian hemp if you want hemp in the U.S., things like this. So that's like the whole reason we trade is comparative advantage. But what free trade deals do is they homogenize regulations. So instead of having different regulatory structures, you have all the countries get together and agree on a regulatory framework. So you just have one regulatory framework instead of 20, and then you lose inter-regime competition and you lose political comparative advantage. And so that's an enormous trade-off to make for slightly smaller tariffs. Like the U.S. has 3% tariffs right now, which historically is as low as tariffs have ever been in the U.S. So, I wish there was zero, but at the expense of one of these free trade deals, I'm not sure that's worth it. And also, I don't think the free trade deals even get tariffs down to zero because there's all sorts of protectionism in them as well. Like you're not allowed to dump goods, whatever the hell that means. Like, how dare you make something cheap? Yeah, I don't got anything else to say. I don't think we have to go for the full hour. So
yeah, I mean, a lot of this is just a lot of the Italians and the French guys are just building off of each other. And I think at one point, I think Kauder said something along the lines of between Aristotle and like the 13th century, they're all just copying each other because it's not worth even mentioning them by name.
Yeah.
So something along those lines.
So pretty much like every economist in the world already knew about marginal utility theory until like Adam Smith. And then for the next 150 years, no economist of high note, at least in England, knew about marginal utility theory. And then people started like reading the old economists and just using common sense again in the 1870s.
I think that's
more or less accurate.
But, yeah, the roundabout
theory.
Roundabout theory of labor. But I think this is a good where Kauder gets very vicious. I think I'll just read it. So the Italo-French school has gone a long way from the teaching of the doctors, and even Aristotle is surpassed, at least in some respects. Yet it was the tragedy of these writers that they wrote in vain. They were soon forgotten. No scholar appeared to make out of these thoughts the new science of political economy. Instead, the father of our economic science wrote that water has a greater utility and a small value. With these few words, Adam Smith had made waste and rubbish out of the thinking of 2,000 years. The chance to start in 1776 instead of 1870 was a more correct knowledge of the value principles had been missed.
So I guess Smith only set economics back for 100 years.
See, there you go. So yeah, I think Kauder does not like Smith at all.
Yeah.
Is what I gathered from these. He's ripping on him more than Rothbard, I think.
Now, I guess, you should always be skeptical, right? Whenever, it becomes very apparent that one author hates another author, it does kind of, detract a little from what that author has to say, right? Of oh, okay, well, now I know that this guy's biased as hell. So, maybe we should do, another meeting where we read, Becky's Great Defense of Smith or something. I know you had mentioned that. Because I'm not, I don't want to completely poo-poo Smith. He said a lot of good things. Yeah, maybe we could do the redeeming aspects of Adam Smith for our next meeting or something.
We can do that.
Dan D'Amico also has some interesting things on kind of Adam Smith and anarcho-capitalism, where I wouldn't call him a modern Rothbardian ANCAP, but he wrote a lot about competition in the court system. Yeah. And he kind of recognized it as why the British common law was kind of such a good working law that was very libertarian, very free market, was because there was actually competition in the court system, which is what the ANCAPs want, where you don't have barriers to entry in the court system, like taxi medallion barriers to entry in a town where there's only one taxi company or there's only a limited number, where you have open entry into the court system. This is actually how the English court system functioned. More or less for a few hundred years, although I think it was kind of dying out / dead by the time Smith wrote. Everything had been solidified in the state law. But he was looking at history, and he said that kind of if there's no competition, the laws will become horrible, and he predicted this. And yet, I think he was right that kind of we have everything that's good in the law, all the libertarian aspects, like trial by jury, innocent until proven guilty. All this stuff comes from this tiny little window where there's competition in the English court system. And I don't know, everything since has seemed to be pretty bad. All the Bill of Rights, they didn't invent the Bill of Rights. That's all stuff from the English common law that was developed, in the competing courts of. So yeah, Dan D'Amico was written about Adam Smith and how he even has kind of theories of crime and punishment. He talks about incarceration and how mass incarceration is always a temptation for society, but is always bad. And kind of he predicts a lot of the problems we have today. Kind of society wasn't rich enough in Adam Smith's day to have mass incarceration. There's we're not gonna feed all these people. What are you, stupid? Yeah, but
all this, or off of your head.
Yeah, but Smith predicted this, that in the future we would have the money to house and feed all these prisoners, and so there would be this enormous temptation to kind of try and modify moral behavior. And he predicted exactly what would happen, which is that it would just be disaster. And
that would be a fun topic. What else? You can also do, going back to the whole competition thing, how the differences between the Scottish universities and the English universities, where the Scottish professors were actually paid for by the students, versus in the English ones, they were, they all had tenure and they all had commission on students, basically, because they were just funded by, I think, the English church or whatever. So it's kind of an interesting.
We're kind of reverting back to that model with the kind of scheme professors have nowadays, where they've got a $400 book that they wrote that you have to buy for the class, and you kind of everyone who hates capitalism poo-poos and goes, oh, how evil. But actually, I don't know, this is kind of just going back to the old model of the students paying the professor instead of having to go through this enormous university bureaucracy, and your pay isn't matched to what the students like. It was, oh no, if you want to sign up for this course and buy the book, the professor, gets the money from the book, and you're paying the professor directly instead of the college. So Because everyone, most like 99.9% of people economics majors included absolutely hate that. And the professor will mandate a plug-in and charge $200 for it.
Limited edition, university edition or something.
Yeah.
So it's only applicable to like I don't know years.
And then like
those are the best.
Every year they'll change just like the order of the answers and nothing else, just so you can't use last year's edition.
And it's from bottom 2. We added a period on page 3. There's now a question mark at the end of this question. There was that one before, and it was not a real question.
Yeah.
So it's like, yeah. But yeah, my favorite was that it was just university edition,
Yeah.
where you can't like just buy it from some other university. Like it's gotta be specifically your school's copy.
Gotta get the cut.
Know it.
Oh, errors and omissions. Andrew Silva is live, it turns out. We thought he was Brandon there, but the court. So Andrew, we're so glad you're here, and we're probably gonna take a trip down to see you in a little bit in Virginia.
Yes, and I guess we could share the story of how he wanted someone to read Planned Chaos by Mises.
Yeah.
So that means we can figure it actually is the real Andrew.
Yeah. That was apparently as soon as he came to, he was asking for Planned Chaos by Ludwig von Mises to be read to him. So we're pretty sure he's Andrew. He's not trying to.
So that's a good sign, and we wish him well.
So next meeting we have, I don't know about a date or anything, but do you want to do Smith?
Smith sounds good.
All right.
So it's going to be, what, the pro Smith side of stuff?
Yeah, I didn't really mean to turn this week's meeting into just trashing on Adam Smith, but it's kind of how it turned out.
I mean, according to Kauder, he's the worst economist ever.
But I know, like, Becky had something about Smith, and I think Dan D'Amico was talking to me about him. I don't know if he's actually written anything on him. I'll have to look up Dan and see if he wrote a paper on that.
What else? Say we could probably pull snippets out of Wealth of Nations, but that might be a bit much.
Yeah, maybe I'll just email Dan and ask him what chapters in Wealth of Nations have to do with like ANCAP legal theory and competing courts and stuff like that. Because that'd be an interesting thing to read.
Yeah.
And then maybe we could, if he has like one chapter that in particular deals with like water diamond paradox and marginal utility, and or like a segment of that chapter, we can exert it.
Sounds good. James Buchanan has a bit about Smith too, about the whole objective value thing in Smith. So that might be worth digging up too.
Is Buchanan an apologist for Smith?
Not in regards to his value theory. So he's very much in the subjectivist camp on that.
Are there any modern economists who don't agree with the marginal revolution? I was trying to think of this. So which ones?
Some of the Marxist economists are still around.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense because Marx was very for labor theory of value.
There are,
but I think even the Marxists though at like UMass Amherst, because I was talking to that economist from UMass Amherst, the famous guy who was on Colbert and all that stuff.
Oh,
yeah. And so UMass Amherst has a Marxist economics staff. They're like the only public college in the world that has a Marxist economics staff. But they're very like reformed 21st century Marxists. Like they all agree with marginal utility theory and supply and demand. They kind of have, Marx was wrong about marginal utility theory. But you're saying there are some people who are just old school. And are they actually teaching anywhere, or is it just kind of internet forums?
I could probably pull out a couple if I have to rack my head to find them. But there was one in particular. What's that guy from Mises Mises does reviews of books? Gordon?
Yeah.
Something Gordon. Yeah, I think he has like a critique of this guy. I'll have to find it. But I'm trying to think. There are some other, a lot of the weird type of. There's some types of post-Keynesians who are also against all the subjective elements of value theory.
Interesting, because I thought they were kind of more on the subjectivist side.
Most of them are, but there's a couple that are just kind of like Kolechkian type of Keynesians, the post-Keynesians variant. I don't like going into too many Ks. But yeah, I think Kolechki was influenced by Marx, so maybe that's where that comes from too. I mean, I don't know. But there are some Kolechki and post-Keynesians out there who are still writing.
So, was it Minsky? No. The founding father of post-Keynesianism starts with an M. Yeah, I wrote in like the 50s.
M.
Anyway, he was apparently very influenced by Marx. So I wonder if that's like the thread that
I think Minsky was influenced by Marx.
Yeah, Minsky.
But he was like 80s or something.
Oh, he was 80s.
That's when he became famous, at least.
Yeah, I know.
But he was probably at school in the 50s, so.
Keen, Steve Keen gave that lecture where he talked about Minsky and Marx as being Minsky very influenced by Marx. I remember we talked about that in the lecture.
Yeah. I know Minsky's book. There's the one where he talks about the whole like instability and stuff like that. And he takes the whole dynamic nature of stuff from Marx, but he might take something from the whole value theory too. I mean,
Well, we made it to an hour, so
yeah.
We have 2 viewers even. Wow.
Yeah.
All right. People are still paying attention at the end. Well, thanks so much for tuning in, guys. And this video will be available to view in a couple of hours. It'll be uploaded in full. So,
yeah. Tune in next time for Smith.
Yep.